By the summer of 1944, the German army was collapsing on two fronts. In the east, the Soviet forces were pushing deep into occupied territory, and in the west, the Allies had landed in Normandy and were steadily advancing. Many high-ranking German officers understood that the war was already lost. Among them was Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, a talented staff officer who had been severely wounded in North Africa yet remained active in strategic planning. Inside the German military, a secret group of officers and civilians had been meeting since 1943. They believed that Adolf Hitler's decisions were destroying Germany and costing countless lives. Their discussions gradually evolved into a plan. Remove Hitler from power, take control of the government, and negotiate peace before the nation was completely ruined. However, they knew that without Hitler's death, the Nazi state would never break apart, and the war would continue. In early 1944, Stauffenberg was promoted and gained access to meetings at Hitler's field headquarters. This changed everything. For the first time, the conspirators had someone close enough to place a bomb near Hitler. The group began forming a detailed plan using an existing emergency operation called Valkyrie, originally designed to suppress internal uprisings. They rewrote parts of the plan so it could be used to seize control of key military units the moment Hitler was confirmed dead. Stauffenberg accepted that he would have to carry out the attack himself. He did not hide the personal risk. He understood that success depended on precision and timing because any mistake would allow the Nazi leadership to regain control. Despite the danger, he believed that stopping Hitler was the only way to save Germany from total destruction. By June 1944, the conspirators had completed most of the planning for their operation. Their strategy depended on using the reserve army in Berlin, which could be mobilized legally through the Valkyrie emergency orders. These orders were originally written to respond to internal disorder, but the conspirators secretly rewrote sections so they could instead use the reserve army to arrest top Nazi officials and take control of key government buildings once Hitler was declared dead. Stauffenberg carried the responsibility of placing the bomb because his new position allowed him direct access to Hitler's military briefings. Even with his injuries, the loss of his right hand, 2 fingers on his left hand, and damage to his eye, he trained himself to arm the explosive charges quickly. His determination impressed the other conspirators, many of whom had been hesitant for months. Stauffenberg's commitment pushed the group forward. The conspirators also prepared a list of figures who would take control after the coup began. General Ludwig Beck was chosen to become head of state, while Karl Gordela was planned as the new chancellor. They hoped that replacing Hitler with known conservative leaders would convince the German public and foreign powers that a legitimate government had taken over. Despite the preparation, internal disagreements slowed progress. Some officers insisted the attack should happen only if key Nazi leaders were present, such as Himmler or Göring. Others argued that waiting would cost them their only real chance. On several occasions, Stauffenberg traveled to Hitler's headquarters ready to act, only to cancel because not enough high-ranking officials were in the room. These delays increased tension within the group. The war was worsening rapidly, and news from the front made the conspirators fear that if they waited too long, Germany would collapse completely before they had the chance to act. By mid-July, Stauffenberg warned the others that hesitation could destroy the entire plan. By mid-July 1944, the pressure inside the conspirators' circle had reached a breaking point. Every day brought new reports of German defeats, and Stauffenberg insisted that they could not postpone the attack any longer. He argued that waiting for all Nazi leaders to be present was unrealistic, and that killing Hitler alone would be enough to trigger the Valkyrie orders and shake the regime. On July 15, Stauffenberg traveled once more to Hitler's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, carrying a bomb prepared for use. The meeting that day placed Hitler within reach, and Stauffenberg had the opportunity to act. However, at the last moment, some conspirators in Berlin hesitated, fearing that the situation was not completely set for the coup. Because the Berlin command was not ready, the attempt was cancelled. Stauffenberg left the headquarters deeply frustrated, knowing how close they had come. After this failure, he confronted the other leaders of the conspiracy. He told them clearly that he would not return to the Wolf's Lair again unless they approved the attack without conditions. His argument was simple. The perfect chance would never come, and the risk of discovery grew every day. The others finally agreed. They accepted that Stauffenberg would act at the next opportunity, regardless of who else attended the meeting. That opportunity came almost immediately. On July 19, Stauffenberg received orders to attend another conference the following day. This time, the conspirators in Berlin prepared to execute Valkyrie as soon as the bomb exploded. They arranged phone networks, drafted immediate arrest orders, and quietly positioned loyal officers. Everything depended on precise coordination between the explosion at the Wolf's Lair and the activation of the reserve army in the capital. Stauffenberg spent the night before the mission in intense concentration. He reviewed the explosives, rehearsed the sequence he would need to perform with one working hand, and confirmed his travel schedule. He understood that this was almost certainly a one-way mission. Nevertheless, he remained committed, convinced that removing Hitler was the only way to prevent Germany from total destruction. On the morning of July 20, 1944, Stauffenberg and his aide Werner von Haeften flew from Berlin to the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. Stauffenberg carried a briefcase containing 2 explosive charges disguised as ordinary equipment. Before the plane landed, he reminded Haeften that the entire operation depended on a single moment. If they hesitated, everything would collapse. Upon arrival, Stauffenberg was escorted through several layers of security. Because he was a senior officer involved in planning reserve forces, the guards recognized him and did not search him thoroughly. This allowed him to keep the explosives hidden. Shortly before the conference, Stauffenberg told the guards he needed a private room to change his shirt, using his injuries as justification. Inside the small hut, he and Haeften worked quickly to arm the bomb. Using only one functioning hand, Stauffenberg crushed the detonator capsule and activated one of the 2 charges. Time was limited, and they could not prepare the second. With the device armed and ticking, Stauffenberg placed it inside the briefcase and returned toward the meeting room. The conference had been moved from the usual reinforced bunker to a wooden building because of the summer heat. This detail would later have a major effect on what happened. When Stauffenberg entered the room, Hitler was standing near a large oak table, surrounded by officers discussing the situation on the Eastern Front. Stauffenberg positioned himself close enough to place the briefcase near Hitler's leg. He slowly set it on the floor beside the heavy table support and pretended to review documents. Knowing the explosion would happen soon, Stauffenberg requested to step outside and make a phone call. The officers allowed it without suspicion. As he walked away from the building, he kept his pace steady to avoid drawing attention, though every second felt dangerously long. Once outside, he headed toward the car where Haeften was waiting. A few moments later, a powerful blast erupted from inside the conference hut. The shockwave broke windows and sent debris flying. Stauffenberg looked back, convinced that no one in the immediate circle around the briefcase could have survived. Believing the mission had succeeded, he and Haeften immediately departed the Wolf's Lair to reach the airfield and returned to Berlin to trigger the coup. As Stauffenberg's car sped toward the airfield, smoke still rose from the destroyed conference hut. He was certain the bomb had killed Hitler. The force of the blast had shattered walls and thrown officers to the ground. From where he stood outside the compound, it appeared impossible for anyone near the briefcase to survive. With this belief, Stauffenberg boarded the plane back to Berlin, convinced the coup could now begin. However, inside the Wolf's Lair, the situation was different. The wooden structure, chosen because of the heat, allowed the explosion to escape outward instead of being contained, which reduced its lethal effect. Even more critical was the table leg. Another officer had unknowingly moved the briefcase behind the thick support, shifting it slightly away from Hitler. The wooden leg absorbed much of the blast. When the smoke cleared, several officers lay injured, and one would later die from his wounds. Hitler himself had been thrown to the floor, his clothes burned and his arm injured, but he survived. Within minutes he was able to stand and speak. His survival changed everything. Instead of confusion, the Nazi leadership quickly regained control. Meanwhile, Stauffenberg's plane radioed no confirmation because the conspirators feared interception. This lack of communication created a dangerous gap. General Frum, head of the Reserve Army in Berlin, demanded proof that Hitler was dead before allowing the conspirators to activate Valkyrie. Without certainty, he refused to support them. By early afternoon, contradictory reports began reaching Berlin. Some messages hinted that Hitler might be alive. Others suggested that the explosion had killed several officers but not the Fuhrer. The conspirators chose to move forward despite the uncertainty, hoping the regime would collapse under the sudden mobilization of the Reserve Army. Stauffenberg landed in Berlin believing the coup was already underway. He rushed to the Bendler Block, the military headquarters, expecting to see orders being carried out. Instead, he found hesitation and confusion. Many officers were unsure of what had happened at the Wolf's Lair, and without clear confirmation of Hitler's death, they hesitated to act. Stauffenberg insisted that the bomb had succeeded. He argued that delays would allow the Nazi leadership to regroup. With growing urgency, he pushed the others to activate Valkyrie immediately, despite the conflicting reports that during the first hours after Stauffenberg returned, the Bendler Block was filled with tension. The conspirators needed to seize control quickly, but the lack of clear information slowed every decision. While Stauffenberg insisted that Hitler was dead, telephones across Berlin began receiving messages from the Wolf's Lair claiming the opposite. Each report deepened the uncertainty. Despite this, Stauffenberg and General Albrecht decided they could no longer wait. In the late afternoon, they issued the Valkyrie orders, mobilizing the Reserve Army across Berlin and several other cities. These orders instructed officers to secure government buildings, disarm SS units, and establish military control. Many units followed the commands without question, believing they were responding to a legitimate emergency. For a short time, the conspirators gained momentum. Certain SS officers were detained, and some communication centers were taken over. However, the success remained fragile because it depended on Berlin believing Hitler was dead. That belief began collapsing when a new source of information appeared: radio broadcasts. By early evening, a message recorded at the Wolf's Lair confirmed that Hitler had survived the attack. His voice, though strained, was unmistakable to listeners. This broadcast spread quickly. Officers who had been obeying Valkyrie now hesitated, confused by the contradiction between the broadcast and the orders from the Bendler Block. Many began refusing commands, waiting for clarification from their superiors. Others silently shifted their support back to the Nazi leadership, uncertain of what would happen next. General Frum, who had been unwilling to support the conspirators from the beginning, used this moment to protect himself. When he received confirmation that Hitler was alive, he attempted to distance himself from the coup and demanded that Stauffenberg and Albrecht stand down. The conspirators refused, knowing that stopping would guarantee the regime's victory. Meanwhile, loyal Nazi officers outside the Bendler Block were organizing a counterattack. They prepared armed units to retake the building and restore the chain of command. As night approached, the conspirators in Berlin still hoped for a last-minute turnaround, but they could no longer rely on the Reserve Army. The momentum of the coup was slipping out of their hands. As evening fell on July 20th, the situation inside the Bendler Block grew increasingly dangerous. The conspirators were running out of time. Units loyal to the Nazi leadership were moving toward the building, and communication lines were turning against them. Every phone call brought worse news. Regional commanders were refusing to obey Valkyrie, SS units were reasserting control, and Hitler's survival was being confirmed by more sources. Stauffenberg, still convinced that the bomb could not have failed, tried to rally the officers in the building. He argued that even if Hitler lived, the coup could still succeed if the army seized control before the regime fully organized its response. But the atmosphere had changed. Many officers who had earlier shown neutrality were becoming fearful. They understood that if Hitler survived, participation in the coup meant certain death. General from, hoping to save himself, gathered loyal officers and attempted to take control of the Bendler block. When Stauffenberg and Albrecht refused to surrender, a tense standoff developed. Soldiers inside the building were unsure whom to obey. Some supported the conspirators, while others remained loyal to the official chain of command. The confusion weakened the conspirators' ability to act. Meanwhile, the Nazi leadership prepared a coordinated counterattack. General Friedrich Thiele, along with other loyal officers, made plans to storm the Bendler block and arrest everyone involved. By late evening, they had surrounded the building with heavily armed units. The conspirators realized that escape was nearly impossible. Inside the headquarters, the conspirators held one final meeting. They discussed whether to continue fighting or attempt negotiation. Stauffenberg remained firm. He argued that giving up would only lead to immediate execution without achieving anything. Yet even his determination could not overcome the collapsing situation around them. As Loyalist forces entered the building, gunfire broke out in the corridors. The conspirators made a brief attempt to defend themselves, but they lacked both numbers and support. Within a short time, loyal officers secured the entrance and began arresting the remaining plotters. The coup had effectively failed. General from, trying to prove his loyalty to Hitler and protect himself from suspicion, took charge of the arrests and prepared to carry out swift punishments. The conspirators knew the end had come. Once Loyalist forces secured the Bendler block, General from moved quickly to demonstrate his loyalty to Hitler. He wanted to distance himself from the coup and avoid being linked to the conspirators, even though he had known about their plans earlier. Acting on his own authority, he ordered the immediate arrest of Stauffenberg, Albrecht, haste, and several other officers involved in the operation. From declared that the conspirators would face a quick court-martial held inside the building. The trial was little more than a formality. There was no defense, no examination of evidence, and no real proceedings. The outcome had been decided before the meeting began. The conspirators were found guilty of treason within minutes. While the sentences were being prepared, the Bendler block was filled with a heavy silence. The remaining officers understood that the coup had collapsed completely, and the consequences would reach far beyond the men present in the building. Dozens of suspects would soon be arrested across Germany, and the Nazi leadership was already preparing large-scale investigations. From hope that acting swiftly would shield him from suspicion, but his actions did not hide his earlier hesitation. Although he appeared loyal, other Nazi officials doubted him, and his attempt to save himself would later fail. At that moment, however, he focused only on showing that he had taken immediate control. Stauffenberg, though exhausted and wounded from the struggle inside the building, remained calm. He showed no sign of regret. His final words to those around him made clear that he believed he had acted for the sake of Germany's future. The other conspirators stood with similar resolve, knowing that their efforts, though unsuccessful, had been made in the hope of ending a destructive dictatorship. Outside the building, Berlin settled into a tense quiet. News of the failed coup spread quickly, and the Nazi leadership prepared to launch widespread arrests and interrogations. The fate of the conspirators at the Bendler block was sealed, and the first stage of the regime's retaliation was about to begin. Late on the night of July 20th, after the rushed court-martial, General from ordered that the sentences be carried out immediately. He claimed this was necessary to restore order, but in truth, he wanted to eliminate witnesses who might reveal his earlier knowledge of the plot. The executions were arranged quickly in the courtyard of the Bendler block. Stauffenberg, Albrecht, haste, and several others were led outside under armed guard. The atmosphere was tense but quiet. The officers who had participated in the coup understood that there was no possibility of saving their lives. Even so, they faced the situation with composure, aware that their actions had been intended to end a destructive dictatorship. Stauffenberg remained steady until the end. Before the order was given, he called out a final statement expressing his belief in a future free from tyranny. His words echoed through the courtyard, leaving a strong impression on those who heard them. The others followed with the same resolve, accepting that their attempt had failed but also knowing that history would one day record their motives. Once the sentences were carried out, the courtyard fell silent again. From hope that this decisive action would convince the Nazi leadership that he had acted responsibly, but he underestimated how deeply the regime intended to investigate the conspiracy. Although he tried to present himself as a loyal officer, his efforts to distance himself were not enough. Throughout Berlin, the Nazi leadership began immediate retaliation. Orders went out to arrest anyone suspected of involvement or sympathy with the conspirators. Military officers, government officials, and civilians connected to the resistance were taken into custody. The failed coup triggered one of the largest internal crackdowns of the entire war. By the early hours of the morning, the Bendler block was firmly under Nazi control, and the last traces of the conspirators' brief attempt to change the course of the war had been erased. But the impact of their actions was only beginning to unfold across Germany. In the days and weeks following July 20th, 1944, the Nazi regime carried out a massive purge. Hundreds of officers, civilians, and anyone suspected of supporting the plot were arrested, interrogated, and executed. Families of the conspirators were also punished, facing imprisonment, property seizure, and social ostracism. The Gestapo led the crackdown with ruthless efficiency, leaving no room for mercy. General Frum, despite his attempts to appear loyal, was soon arrested. Hitler distrusted his motives and ordered his execution in March 1945. The failure of the coup reinforced Hitler's control over the military, and the leadership became even more suspicious of any dissent. Yet, the conspirators' attempt had shown that opposition existed even within the German army, and their courage was remembered quietly by those who had known them. Stauffenberg and the other key conspirators became symbols of resistance to tyranny. Though their mission failed, history recognized their intentions. They had acted to try to save Germany from complete destruction and to stop Hitler's dictatorship. Memorials, books, and documentaries later recounted their bravery, emphasizing the moral choice to act despite near-certain death. The July 20th plot also influenced the post-war view of German military officers. While most of the Wehrmacht had remained loyal to Hitler, the conspirators demonstrated that not all officers were complicit in Nazi crimes. Their story became a reminder that even in the darkest times, individuals could resist unjust authority, risking everything for their principles. Though the coup failed, the actions of Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators left an enduring mark on history. Their determination, planning, and moral conviction are remembered as a rare example of organized resistance from within a regime that tolerated almost no dissent. Their legacy continues to inspire discussions about courage, responsibility, and the difficult choices faced in times of war.